The same way we said ceasefire for Gaza, for Palestine, we now have to say end the blockade on Cuba. And we have to say it over and over and over.
That vision of that darkened hospital and the descriptions of the infant mortality raising, why would Americans support that?
Hi, I'm Liz. How important is for a congressperson in the United States come and see Cuba firsthand?
We have the ability to affect the laws that could supersede potentially the president's actions with what he's doing with the blockade and other actions to Cuba. So having us here as the eyes and ears of the American people, we represent our constituents, but we're also able to get some of the images that people don't see from Cuba right now out by talking about it. We have a platform to talk about it. And I just think at a time right now when people are so aware about human rights, especially in Gaza, you know, the awareness that didn't exist a few years ago, I think people just don't know about Cuba. And I think part of our job is to help lift that information.
The sanctions that the Trump administration has put in, the executive orders, we heard somebody use over and over again, many people use the word siege. And to me, that was so visual, right? That people do not know directly how bad it's gotten in Cuba because of the United States policies. We help shape United States policies, and we have an obligation both to our own constituents, the voters who vote for us, the communities we represent, because what we are doing here in terms of the United States policies is affecting Cuba, it's affecting Mexico, it's affecting Colombia, it's affecting Belize, it's affecting Spain and Italy. We've heard from people across the globe about the negative impacts from the executive orders of Trump and the blockade that has been ongoing for decades. It's our job to hear that so that we can go and make sure that we tell the American people and that we share with our colleagues who might have a different vision of Cuba because they haven't been here recently or they've never been here.
Ultimately, it is our own policy that is impacting everyday people, and it has a real consequence back home. When you see Cuban people over the last 5 years who have entered the United States seeking asylum, there are people who say, oh, there are more people coming in here. It's not our problem. Actually, it is. Like, it's not our fault that their government's this or this. Actually, if our own policy, whether it's executive order or sanctions, is creating this chokehold on the people, then we do have a responsibility to understand that our own policy has real consequences on people around the world. And that's why I think being here is so incredibly important, because what's happening to people here on the blockade, on sanctions, is a policy choice. And a policy choice that we have to talk about, that we could end by ending a blockade, by really also understanding the impact of sanctions.
You both mentioned Trump executive orders, and one of the things that the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, as the justification of this executive order in saying that Cuba represents a national emergency, that is also Cuba also an unusual and extraordinary threat to the United States. What is your impressions about Cuba represent a threat to the United States of America?
The Cuban people are beautiful people who just want to be able to live. Many Cuban people are saying, like, we want to be able to celebrate our culture, listen to our music, be able to live in community with one another, not feel the necessity of having to migrate to another country that is not our own. In none of the 3 days that we have been here have I seen that the Cuban people are a threat to the American people. What I've seen is this real desire of being in solidarity with one another. I heard the word sisterhood or brotherhood over and over from the Cuban people themselves, that they want to see the opportunity of partnership with the United States, that they love the American people and they want to be in community with us. That's not terrorism. That's an act of community that we should embrace. what I believe is Marco wants something from the Cuban people, and he's using the Cuban people as a boogeyman.
It actually hurts us as a nation. So, you know, I don't think there's any justification for it, but authoritarian leaders can lead easier if they scare people, and they use fear as a powerful tactic. And I think Donald Trump is using it like that, and Marco Rubio clearly has a predisposition to what he wants to do.
I want to read the list because I think it's important, because when you hear about the Cuba in the United States, people hear the things, that the justifications that Marco Rubio and Donald Trump use. The first one is, of course, Cuba is a failed state. Cuba hosts Russian and Chinese spy bases. Cuba harbors Hamas and Hezbollah and terrorists around the globe. Cuba sponsored terrorism. Cuba destabilized the Western Hemisphere through migration and violence. Cuba commits human rights abuses. Cuban leaders profit while ordinary Cubans suffer. And Cuba spreading communist ideas, policies, and practices. This is the whole thing. And my question is, who is maintaining both President and the Secretary of State accountable for this? Because I haven't seen any corporate media in the United States say, wait, what is the arguments that you have to justify that?
Part of the role that Congress has to play is to conduct oversight, so that the president, a secretary of state, when they make claims, they actually provide the proof. Mm-hmm. And for all of that long list of claims, we have seen no proof. And I think that that's one of the things that the American people, the American media, but the American Congress needs to demand. Because what we are seeing instead is that on an international basis, we've met with small businesses from here, we've met with diplomats from another country who want to help out. Now, the kinds of countries that are sitting there saying, we want to help the Cuban people, are not the kind of countries that are going to want to help a country that's engaged in terrorism, right? They want to help Cuba because they're in the hemisphere, because they've received doctors from Cuba, they've received health care. Those are the kinds of relationships that we have seen diplomats talk about, business people talk about, and the Cuban people talk about. Those are not terrorist relationships. Those are business relationships. Those are humanitarian relationships. Those are the kinds of relationships that build neighbors and allies, right? And Cuba is our neighbor, and we should develop Cuba as an ally in the Western Hemisphere. We should develop all of our Latin American countries as allies, and the only way you do that is entering into relationships with them from a place of respect, right? And we don't have that right now, but we will be saying, when Democrats take control of Congress, we will have the power to call Marco Rubio in there and say, prove it. Show us the receipts, because we have never seen them.
And what happened meanwhile?
I think meanwhile, you have members of Congress in key committees that are going to continue to push that. I mean, Mark now serves in the Foreign Affairs Committee. And I know that when Cuba comes up, which it will, because there are some of our colleagues there from Florida, with a Salazar last name maybe at the end, who will attempt to continue to paint Cuba in a particular way with a lot of the things that you just read there. Mark can say, I've been there, and there is no evidence. And I think it's important to say that, yes, there are things that we must do when we're in the majority, and there are things that we will start doing literally tomorrow when we get there. But I want to just note one more thing that Teresa said that I think is so important. You know, what I heard from a lot of the Cuban people today, from some of the civil society, from organizations here, they've trained community organizers. They've trained on popular education. They've trained on healthcare systems that are innovative, of people all over the world who have come to Cuba to learn these innovative strategies on how to help strengthen their own countries, infrastructure and healthcare and community. And so I think it's important for us to know, and I think what you said was so beautiful, that there's a real opportunity if we saw Cuba and Latin America as a partner for the United States to also benefit from that. We have a lot to learn about vaccines or the latest research on diabetes medication or prevention, or the latest research on Alzheimer cures from the Cuban people. And so what would it look like if instead of calling the boogeyman, right, or calling countries that could be partners of the boogeyman because a particular individual wants to seek profit from the people, and we actually saw them as brothers and sisters where we can be building with. I think the United States could actually really benefit from that partnership. And we want to talk about those possibilities.
I agree with you, but historically, the U.S. policy on Cuba has been bipartisan. Like, there has been a policy that has been maintained and support for Republicans, but also for Democrats, except a couple of progressive Democrats like you guys. I think that that's the only opposition that inside of the Congress they have a U.S. policy on Cuba. My question for you would be, like, do you see that actually this is changing inside of the Congress in the U.S.?
Well, among the American people. A few years ago, no one was saying block the bombs going to Gaza. In fact, people largely weren't aware of what was going on in Gaza, right? Because it didn't get coverage. That's not that different than Cuba. People don't really know what's going on here. But people now really care about human rights. And also, the Trump administration is so overreaching with a designation of terrorism, stopping fuel and medicine, which we don't even do usually in war. Those are all things that overreach will not work in their advantage once the American people really know what's going on.
The question that American people are asking now is how the President Trump's actions across the globe with regards to tariffs, with regards to war, are so unpopular right now. And the American people are understanding that those bad foreign policy decisions that he is making are negatively impacting them. And what we are doing in Cuba is also negatively impacting Americans because we are cutting off the possibility of trade. We are creating a potential migratory explosion as Cubans will be forced to leave because they can't survive here, right? We are choking all that up, and it is costing us money. Like, do we want to spend our taxpayer dollars on a blockade of Cuba, or would we prefer to spend that on our own health care, on our own cost of living, right? It's that, and that's the question to ask, is does this policy improve the lives of American citizens or not? And right now it does not. And so that's the point that we will be raising as well.
Do you have the opportunity to talk about this point with the U.S. ambassador in Cuba?
They wouldn't meet with us.
They would not meet.
That's normal?
No. No. When I was here on an official congressional delegation 3.5 years ago, we met extensively with the U.S. representative and others under the Trump administration. I don't think they really want people to know what's going on because they're putting a false narrative out there. And you went through that list of the false narrative.
I think let's be blunt. There is nothing normal about the Trump administration. He does not believe in democracy. He is attempting to implement his own policy of profit and ego and white supremacy. And so it is our responsibility as Congress, and I think what you keep hearing say is to assert our authority as, yes, an equal branch of government, but the one that actually creates the laws and enforces them by doing oversight to ensure that he knows that he doesn't get to call the shots and create his false narrative of people, whether it's Cuba or whether it's people in Gaza or whether it's people in Sudan or other parts of the world. And so there's nothing normal about what he is doing. And it's not going to stop us from conducting our work of oversight.
Is there any way in which U.S. policy in Cuba could be justified?
We don't do it to anyone else. And we have other countries that you could argue are actually maybe a threat to the United States or a threat to other nations. But Cuba hasn't shown any of that. So this is all a political problem with people in South Florida who maybe have come from Cuba, who want to come back, I think, and monetize what they once had, and a politician, Marco Rubio, who this is his priority, who I don't think have been here. I don't think Marco Rubio's been to Cuba in the...
No, not a single time.
Yeah.
We were waiting for him.
He's welcome. I'll travel with him.
You travel with him.
I'll carry his bag. You want to do something? We'll make sure he's comfortable. but he's not seeing.
Or not. Let him live through this and see the experience of his own policy.
Do you think that it is possible that more members of Congress coming to Cuba in the future? Republicans want to?
We would encourage, I think that our goal is to raise awareness, and like we needed to change the law. So we need to go back and say we have an example that we can follow of how you can, and Cuba has changed, like the 176 reforms that have been proposed that we heard people talk about them. Someone said, like, I like some of them, we like them general, but we're going to push back on this, or we think we should do better that. I mean, we heard from community organizers, we heard from small businesses, we heard from farmers, we heard from so many people, like regular people in the street know about those 176 reforms, right? Because there's a discussion of this movement in policy in Cuba that would actually be more favorable to better business relations, not just between the United States and Cuba, but between Cuba and other Latin American countries, Spain, Italy. So I think that there is great opportunity. This can be fixed. Now, what's scary is how do the Cuban people survive until we can get to that point?
The same way we said ceasefire for Gaza, for Palestine, we now have to say end the blockade on Cuba. And we have to say it over and over and over. And I think it's the responsibility that we have, because I think Mark keeps saying this, we have to keep amplifying the realities of what's happened. And it's why it's so important that we came here. It's hard to leave our districts when we're in Congress sometimes for 4 or 5 days debating, trying to fight what they're doing there. But it was important for us to physically be here because we see the connection between our work and oversight and the human rights work that we are so deeply committed to. Because I think Teresa, when she talked about, you got to come back to the humanity and the babies.
There is something that you has experienced here that really touched you, that makes you think, oh my God, we need to change the U.S. policy on Cuba?
Walking through a hospital that is dark and empty because we have cut off energy, we've cut off fuel, so they cannot run their diagnostic machines, and then hearing about the increase in babies dying, pregnant mothers dying because of our policy. That vision of that darkened hospital and the descriptions of the infant mortality raising, just like, why would we do that? Why would Americans support that? So that's one of the visuals that it will stick with me.
I think for me, it's we're forcing an involuntary global blockade. It's not just the United States' blockade, but when we say international state of terror, you can't use financial systems. So no one who's trying to have a small business and trying to change Cuba in the way that supposedly Donald Trump wants can even do it. Then you take the fact that you don't have fuel and you have the rolling blackouts and 20% of the people have left Havana, the fact that so many people have fled to the United States because of the conditions, and yet we're forcing every country to have to also have a blockade, even if they don't want it. That just seems wrong on many levels and really is hurting the people of Cuba very badly.
For me, protecting the sovereignty of the United States is incredibly important. And the idea that we do not respect the sovereignty of other nations, it's so heartbreaking to me. And to see that, I think to Mark's point, that the Cuban people, and to hear a young 29-year-old man say, look, can you tell your president, either he has his foot on my neck, either he ends the life or he pulls the foot off my neck, but we can't keep living this way. That a people, 9 million people, feel that they're being choked by a policy of a country that could be a partner, that could be the country of opportunities and partnerships and a model of democracy and freedom and opportunity. That country that made it possible for me to be a congresista. That country could be choking that young man who is a brilliant engineer. Is a reminder that we have a responsibility to change course, and I refuse to believe that we cannot.
Well, and don't forget, it worked during President Obama. When he opened up relations, people from the U.S. came down here and had vacations and loved coming to Cuba, and the people of Cuba thrived. and there was no terrorism threat. Any of the things that are out there are completely false that the Trump administration's put out there. So it worked. And now we went back to 65 years ago, insanity of making things not work. So I just think in recent history, we have a very good example of what Cuba really is and can be, and instead what we're doing to it.